My name is Nicole Cornish. I'm a debate coach at Athens High School. I'm camp director at Texas Speech and Debate Camp, and I am one of the topic authors for the 1819 policy debate topic on immigration. Andrew Cornish is here with me, and Andrew contributed quite a bit to the topic paper, and so he's going to help in some of his slides and kind of give his input since he was part of that as well. So this is the official wording for the 1819 topic. The United States federal government should substantially reduce its restrictions on legal immigration to the United States. And I want to start by talking about some of the background behind immigration policy and kind of what leads us to where we are today and how immigration policy works and functions. So immigration policy has historically been a method to exclude certain groups of people from the United States. So the way that we have framed immigration policy so far in the United States has not been a focus necessarily on economics or jobs or environment or population, but we've said, like, right now at this time, like, we don't want these groups of people. And so the kind of impetus for this topic was this idea that Andrew and I had, that there had to be a different way to look at and to think about immigration policy. And so we wanted to write a topic that would challenge high school debaters to see what sort of policies they could come up with that just radically changed the way immigration policy looks in the United States. So another major problem with immigration policy is that the last comprehensive immigration policy was passed in 1965. So that's obviously a pretty outdated piece of legislation, and it also only had 2 adjustments since 1965. So you can imagine there's quite a bit in the language of that law that's pretty antiquated. So we'll talk a little bit as we go through about why that's the case, but predominantly that law still exists from 1965 because Congress cannot get on the same page about what sorts of immigration changes they want to make. So it's this sort of constant battle in Congress between the Republicans and the Democrats about what things would make it into a new comprehensive immigration policy and what things would not. And so we'll talk about this in the sort of negative portion of this discussion, but like, if you want links to your politics DISADs, like, this topic gives you links to your politics DISADs, because it is definitely something that is debated in Congress. So the 2 adjustments that were made, one was in 1986 and the last one was in 1990. So even then, 2018, the fact that our last adjustment to this antiquated law was in 1990, there are a lot of things that could be changed and need to be changed. So some other things that have happened kind of outside of Congress, outside of legislation, President Obama, during his term, issued an executive order that initiated DACA, and that was an attempt by the Obama administration who wanted to pass Dreamers in Congress. So they wanted to pass the Dreamers Act that would provide citizenship for a group of undocumented immigrants that we classify as Dreamers. And Congress was stalling that legislation and not passing it. And so President Obama passed DACA, which is close to what he wanted passed in Congress with the Dreamers Act. And then we felt like Trump's campaign made the immigration topic significantly relevant. So Trump's campaign discussion revolved significantly around immigration and discussions of the border wall. And so that made it, again, a topic of importance in the United States political sphere, and so something we wanted to introduce into the high school debate sphere. And then what I found interesting when we were doing that topic research is that the 2016, there was a study done in 2016 by the Pew Research Center that said 70% of voters identified immigration as very important. And that matters because that means that 70% of voters put immigration as important to their election decision above the economy and environment and some like big social issues that you might traditionally think voters care the most about. They put immigration at the forefront. And so that said to me that there was clearly something that needed to be discussed about immigration. So, anybody diagram sentences in English class? So this is the resolution kind of diagrammed out, and there are sort of several critical words that we wanted to discuss when we talk about the resolution.
As in most topics, there's several keywords here. The first is nothing new. It's reduce. Obviously, you're going to see a lot of cases, or a lot of negative teams say that reduce is not the same as eliminate. By that I mean, in order to reduce something, you have to have something already there, and you have to bring it to a lower level. You can't completely eliminate it. So arguably, open borders, just saying anyone can come in and out of the United States without any regulation, any check, is arguably not topical. I think you can make a pretty good argument that it is topical, but the other kind of definition of reduce that you'll see a lot is to make less. So some apps will try to give rights, i.e. social services, lawyers, stuff like that, to undocumented immigrants, and that would probably not be topical. They may say it would reduce a barrier to their entry, like a psychological barrier or something like that. So you can make arguments that it is, but I think you'll probably be facing kind of an uphill battle on giving rights to immigrants. Oops. Try and work the clicker. Restrictions is obviously the next word here. So restrictions we put in the topic specifically. We did not want to write a topic that said you have to increase the amount of immigrants coming in. I don't think any AF plan can do that. By fiat anyway. So restrictions means you must actually change the barriers to immigration. That could be a cap on a certain type of visa. That can be a lot of different things, but it can't be just to say we're going to bring in more immigrants to the United States. There has to be a mechanism there for doing that. So again, giving social services to immigrants is probably not topical in that it doesn't really reduce a restriction. Probably a good way to think about a restriction would be a law. Something in place that's preventing the immigrants from coming to the United States legally. It's always an issue here. I think that it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the same as on every topic. The federal government should reduce its restrictions, means that it refers to the federal government. So that means Arizona and Texas have some pretty strict immigration laws. The AF case probably can't just reduce those restrictions. They have to reduce federal restrictions. We thought that was important to limit the topic. I think that's good negative ground. Saying you can reduce Arizona or Texas or some border states' immigration law is probably a great negative counterplan that you could read. But it's not an AF case on this topic. So an interesting thought is that the word to is important. So the United States federal government should reduce its restrictions on legal immigration to the United States. It doesn't say in the United States. So I think a pretty good negative argument is to say that reducing restrictions or barriers to people becoming legal that are already in the United States is not topical, i.e. Dreamers. The DACA program might not be topical. I think, again, there are some pretty good arguments about why that can be topical, but on face, I would lean toward untopical. And then, of course, we have legal immigration. This by itself could consume an entire lecture. So I'm sure there will be some questions about this. I think one of the good things about this topic is it definitely makes topicality important. Legal immigration does not have a very clear definition. There's very good evidence that says it's one thing, and there's very good evidence that says it's another. So you will have some really good topicality debates, and you'll have good evidence on those. One interpretation of it is that immigration refers to immigrants collectively. So immigrants are not the same as non-immigrants. That seems self-explanatory, but if you haven't gotten to this already, most visa categories are classified as non-immigrant visas. So, H-1B visas are classified as non-immigrant visas. Most are. There are some, obviously, that are not, but most visas are temporary visas, and so they are classified as non-immigrant visas. Then there's the other side of this that says, this sample definition just says there are 5 main categories of immigration. One of those is family-based immigration, employment-based immigration, which would be H-1B visas. Diversity immigration, there's a whole diversity visa that has a whole slew of issues with it as well. Refugee and asylee immigration, so asylum seekers, Syrian refugees. Under this definition, that would be topical. And other forms of humanitarian relief. So there are definitely definitions on both sides, but I do think it's important to know that there will be a good debate to be had on this. But if there is a consensus, most evidence would lean towards this, is that illegal immigration refers to granting admissions to persons to the United States for legal permanent residence. There are a few very key words in that phrase there. The first is admission. So, admission requires one of 2 things to be considered admission. The first, you get a visa on your passport. You get that visa from any consulate office or whatever, and an inspection at a port of entry. All that means is that you come into the United States and a customs agent asks you why you're here and stamps your passport. An inspection is not a big deal. It's not confusing. But that's the standard way to enter the United States. However, there is also the adjustment of status. This is less common in the literature, but it is very commonly there that admission can be an adjustment of status. This is how you would access things like Dreamers. Okay? So if you wanted to say that we will grant legal permanent residence status to all the Dreamers in the United States, or all undocumented immigrants, however you want to do that, you would access legal immigration via this definition that says an admission is an adjustment of status. You would adjust their status from a temporary visa, you would adjust their status from an undocumented immigrant to a legal permanent residence. That is classified as admission to the United States. The next word in that, I think, is pretty obvious. It's legal permanent residence. So in order to be a legal permanent resident of the United States, you have a green card. That means you can work and live in the United States indefinitely. So that means that there is no timeline on this. There's no, you have to work for 2 years, then go back and apply again. H-1B visas are temporary, so maybe you grant them legal permanent residence status. Indefinitely is important. You have to grant them permanent residence.
So I do want to point out what Andrew gave you there is really important, because there are a ridiculous number of definitions that exist of the word to. And so if you really want to read Dreamers as an affirmative, and you get into this topicality debate with someone who says, but hey, the resolution says the word to, and they're already in the United States, that's not topical. I think that what Andrew gave you is a better way to answer that topicality debate than to be debating over like various definitions of the word to. I think that probably will get convoluted for the judges, and I think probably gets into some semantics. And so what Andrew is giving you is a different way to respond to that to argument by saying, it's not really about the word to, it's about the word legal immigration, and the term legal immigration also includes a change in status. So I think that if Dreamers is an app that, like when the topic came out, you're like, I really want to read this affirmative, that would be a way for you to access it. So we started with what I think is going to be the most popular affirmative on the topic, and that's H-1B visas. So Andrew already kind of alluded to this, but the concern some people are going to have for H-1B visas is that it is quite literally labeled as a non-immigrant visa. So, like, if you look up H-1B visas in the law, it will literally say a non-immigrant visa to. So that's a topicality question that you have to be prepared to answer. Andrew's right. I think there are some really good answers to that. So I think that you talk about the term like legal immigration as a term of art, and I think that helps you access those things that are considered non-immigrant visas. And I think that it's a discussion about what immigration means as opposed to immigrant, right? It's a non-immigrant visa, but the topic uses the term immigration, and those are two different things. So I'm not saying H-1B visas or any other visas are not topical. I'm saying that when you read a visa affirmative, you need to be prepared for the topicality argument that says, isn't this labeled a non-immigrant visa? So it's just a question you have to be prepared to answer. So H-1B visas are employment-based visas. So they are designed to bring skilled workers to the United States. So the argument is that there are not enough H-1B visas to go around. So the United States caps all types of visas, and they cap those visas per country as well. And so you can kind of get as specific there as maybe you want, which maybe some people would say is why the topic is a little big. But you can kind of get as specific as you want about which country, which cap you want to raise for H-1B visas. But the literature is pretty clear that we don't have enough, that we are leaving lots of skilled workers out of the visa program because we just don't have enough every year to go around. These are technically temporary visas, although the way that those H-1B visas are renewed, like people can be here for a significant amount of time on an H-1B visa. So your advantages for this kind of affirmative are going to be like what I would consider big stick advantages. So the advantages that you read are going to talk about the economy. They're going to say things like, we need to improve our economy by attracting more skilled workers, and so we should raise the limit on H-1B visas so that we get those skilled workers to come to the United States. There's also some interesting advantages about like cybersecurity in general. So this is something that says we need skilled workers that know lots of things about computer and cyberspace and can do things to keep our systems in the United States secure. And the best way to do that is to attract skilled workers from anywhere. And you can talk about technology. It's the same kind of structure as the second advantage that I talked about, but you can sort of make these arguments that the best way to improve technology, particularly in the United States, is to attract these workers from other countries or from anywhere that maybe have more experience or knowledge than maybe anyone here in the United States does. So the biggest questions that you're going to have to answer the topicality argument on non-immigrant visas. And I think that this app is probably going to link really hard into any sort of like capitalism argument, or even if you're thinking, well, I debated an area where nobody would read that anyway, nobody would read a critique. I think there's a decent argument to be made against this app that the way that H-1B visas are structured is just kind of bad. So the way that it works is that in order to come to the United States on an H-1B visa, you have to have an employee sponsor, meaning you have to have a company that's like already committed to say, I'm going to hire John Smith to come work at my company. I'll be his sponsor. John Smith applies for a visa with that company as a sponsor. So it's not like you can come here and then look for a job. The downside to that then is that gives all of the control to the employer, because the employer can then pull their sponsorship at any time and you have to go back. So that's problematic because the literature will show that you have people who are working with subpar income in subpar conditions because they don't have any other escape. They're going to do it because to argue with their employer, to debate with their employer about why they should have more money or whatever, could mean that their employer pulls their sponsorship. And so that seems like maybe just in general a not good structure for those individuals. So I think refugees is probably also a possible topic on this particular resolution. So the idea of refugees, right, is that there are people, Syria is probably going to be the most popular, but that there are people all over the world that are escaping some sort of political turmoil, some sort of political violence. And that these people apply for refugee status in countries so that they can move somewhere else, move out of their current situation that maybe is dangerous or violent for them and their families. So refugees is a very particular subset of the literature, and I do want to caution you here because in the background part of this topic lecture, I gave you kind of a list of sort of 3 major laws that I think are important for immigration law. If you are really excited about a refugee affirmative, you're going to need to go find those laws as well, and I can certainly help you do that, but refugee law is sort of separate from some of the other laws that I discussed in the background literature. So there are some additional pieces of legislation that I didn't include because they're very specific to refugees. I think there's a really good counterplan to the refugees affirmative because there is a really good article that I gave you there. It's in the November-December 2017 edition of Foreign Affairs, and that is a really interesting piece of literature that talks about how it's better for refugees to resettle in neighboring countries, that is more successful because their culture is more similar and they tend to be safer, they tend to be happier, that tends to be a much better situation. And so I think there's a pretty good counterplan option to say maybe that's a better solution to the refugees situation. Obviously, the biggest advantage to this topic is that there is a lot of really, really recent literature on refugees. So Trump sort of kind of escalated refugees into the political conversation with things like the travel ban. And so that has sort of spurred a lot of really interesting discussions in the literature. So you'll have plenty of good things to read and to talk about on refugees. And I think your advantages would be some like moral humanitarian advantages for the Refugees Act, right? You would be saying things like, this is just the right thing to do for us to make the United States a place where people can come to find safety. So if you're interested in those types of advantages, that's what you would be reading on this particular affirmative. Sort of the biggest disadvantage, again, is this topicality argument about whether or not refugees are included in the definition of legal immigration. I think that's a harder battle to fight than the non-immigrant visas. So Andrew showed you sort of 2 like polar opposite definitions of legal immigration. He showed you like legal immigration does not include non-immigrant visas, it would be very narrow. And then he showed you kind of the broadest end of the spectrum. It's like, it's all of these 5 things. So I think realistically then, somewhere in the middle is probably the more accurate definition of legal immigration. And I think refugees could be a difficult discussion to have about whether or not that's included in immigration. Again, not a discussion you can't have. Just know if that's the affirmative that you're going to read, you have to be prepared for those sorts of arguments. So this is what I think is another interesting affirmative. So these are U visas and T visas. They're very similar. Andrew's going to talk to you about the difference between U visas and T visas.
So they're both going to get you access to most of the same advantages. The main reason I think the U visa is a better affirmative than the T visa is we never reach the cap on T visas. And so there's not a need to raise the cap, although you could change some of the restrictions on it. The T visa is a much stricter visa. Essentially, the main difference is that a T visa, in order to get it, you have to have been trafficked into the United States. So you can't be fleeing from Mexico or Asia or Africa or anywhere else into the United States to run away from your traffickers. You have to literally be trafficked from that country into the United States. So there's a lot less applicants for that type of visa. Other main difference is that's probably a benefit to T visas in the status quo is they do not have to cooperate with law enforcement. A U visa, you do have to cooperate with law enforcement. And so, so a U visa, you have to actually talk with law enforcement. You have to be willing to do that, even though you may have been sex trafficked, you may have been any sort of thing that a lot of times you don't want to talk to police about. And so there's not enough U visas. I think there was like a 6-year waiting period to get a U visa. Now, as it says, the biggest advantage to this type of affirmative is you have really good moral type advantages here. There's not a whole lot of people that say, no, we shouldn't help people who are human trafficked. But, like we've already referred to, it is a non-immigrant visa. I don't think that's that big of a deal. I think there's a lot of good answers to that, but you're going to hear that topicality probably every time. The other biggest disadvantage on a case level is if you're applying for these visas, even though there may be a 6-year waiting period, you can actually still wait in the United States until you get that visa. So you can come into the United States, apply for a U visa, and then just stay there while you wait on your application to process. So there's a lot of authors out there that say there's not an issue with the waiting period for U visas because you're still in the United States. We're not sending you back to wait on your visa. We're not sending you back to your visas. So I think you have to overcome that, but I think there's probably a pretty good argument to be made that since there is such a waiting list, a lot of people will not come because of that waiting list that we could be helping otherwise.
Okay, there's another sort of category of visas that we would consider family-sponsored visas. So this absolutely represents the biggest subset of backlog in our immigration process. So the topic paper that Andrew and I worked on shows some different pie charts and bar graphs about like how many immigrants we have waiting per country, per visa category, and the biggest number is most certainly in family-sponsored visas. So the idea of a family-sponsored visa is one member of the family has gotten a visa to the United States and is a permanent resident in the United States and now would like to bring the rest of his or her family to the United States. And so, like we talked about on H-1B visas, where there has to be an employer that says, you know, I sponsor this person to come. Similarly, family-sponsored visas are the same. You have to have a family member who's a permanent resident sponsor you and say, I sponsor my nephew. I want him to come to the United States with me and to fill out that application. And there are levels of family-sponsored visas that are determined by the degree of separation of the family member. So there are more family-sponsored visas for immediate family members that are sponsoring their other immediate family members, and then there get less and less as the family gets extended. So the goal of these visas are family reunification, but I want to be clear when I talk about this because first, we had no idea when we submitted the topic a year ago. Yeah, guess we submitted the topic a year ago. We had no idea that this sort of political atmosphere of like separating families and the things that President Trump has been doing. We had no idea that was going to be in the news. So I want to be clear that these are not the same things. So when I say that the goal is family reunification, I am not talking about the same President Trump policy that separates families. I will talk about that, but this is a separate sort of issue. So these are families that are currently separated in 2 different countries, and a family member in the United States would like to sponsor their other family member from the other country to come to the United States. So that's an affirmative where you could again talk about some morality and human rights claims. There are some good discussions from Human Rights Watch and some international human rights agencies that say things like, that it's not okay that families are separated. Like if you're going to let one member of the immediate family have a visa to the United States, you need to let the rest. So that's a good discussion to be had there. So President Trump's policies are distinct, but they are family-based, and that is family separation in detention centers. So that's distinct because what President Trump's policy is like a mother and her child are both currently in the United States undocumented, and they are discovered somehow as being undocumented, and the process then is for them to be sent to a detention center. But according to President Trump's policies, they're sent to 2 different detention centers. So that is a discussion that is happening currently in the news. So this is, if I could suggest, like, and I don't want to control your sort of affirmative choices. I want you to have kind of all of the options available to you. I think that you are on pretty shaky ground if you want to talk about that type of family separation. The reason that I think that is because, one, I think you've got way too much movement happening in policy and in law, and sort of President Trump's presidency has been so different in the sense that it is very dynamic and changing. And so because of that, you would potentially be in a situation where your affirmative was needing to like be changing with like 2 a.m. tweets from the president and things like that. And so like that maybe is not where you want to be with an affirmative case. Additionally, there is a like pending court issue that the courts are going to have to figure out, because the Supreme Court, there's something called the Flores ruling. It's a Supreme Court decision that said that children, minors, who are undocumented in the United States, if it is discovered that they are undocumented, they can only be detained for up to 5 days. So they can't be detained for these extended periods of time, according to the Supreme Court. So most recently, a lower appellate court, in a ruling of President Trump's policies, said that there cannot be a policy that separates children and parents at the detention center. So I want you to think about that, because now these 2 rulings both exist, these 2 court rulings. So if a mother and a father and their child, according to this lower appellate court, have to be detained together, and also the Flores ruling is still true, and children can only be detained for 5 days, then does the whole family get released after 5 days? That seems to be the only option based on these 2 court rulings. And that lower appellate court ruling just happened weeks ago. So that's the other issue probably with this affirmative, is that I feel very confident that more court rulings will come out to sort of rectify that. Not that they're contradictory, but there's got to be some court rulings to clean up that language, because it does seem to maybe not jive together. So if you're reading that affirmative, that's also something that can happen kind of any day, and then all of a sudden you're addressing that issue. particular type of visa, and I'm going to go kind of like way back and talk about something called the doctrine of coverture, which is really old, antiquated. It originated as British common law. And it does not necessarily, it's a broader term than just immigration. So the doctrine of coverture is not just about immigration policy. It is a doctrine that existed a long, long time ago that said a woman only had as much rights or property as her husband had. So the doctrine of coverture says that, like, a woman who is married and is under coverture, she only owns the property in so much as her husband owns it. And that's it. So she doesn't own any part of property herself. So that obviously sounds strange, and it should, because it's, like I said, it's a very antiquated idea, and it doesn't exist anywhere in legal policy anymore except immigration law. So in immigration law, H-1B visa holders are subject to the doctrine of coverture, which means if you are a married woman and your husband gets an H-1B visa and you travel to the United States with him, you are only legal in the United States, you only have a visa in the United States in so much as your husband has one. So there's literature that indicates that that means that women exist in abusive relationships with men because to divorce their husband would mean that they have to leave the United States, because their legal status only exists in so much as her husband's legal status exists. So there is a lot of literature on that. Like, you're very clearly probably on the right side of, like, that's not okay. Women shouldn't be, like, forced to be in abusive relationships or leave a country. That's a decision probably that women should not have to make. I will say, however, that an argument that you especially would have to respond to is that there was this legislation called the Violence Against Women Act that was passed, and that was passed in an effort specifically to protect women who are in abusive households that fall under the doctrine of coverture. So you would have to win as an affirmative case that, like, that act is just a Band-Aid and that the doctrine of coverture is bad and we should just remove that doctrine altogether, as opposed to just passing this sort of Band-Aid act called the Violence Against Women Act. So just know that that is a hurdle that you would have to jump for this particular affirmative. Okay, Dreamers is also a possible affirmative area for you to look at, and like I said, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the discussion as well. So Dreamers are defined as undocumented immigrants who were brought to the United States by their parents as small children. They, most of the time, have no memory of any other country but the United States, and yet they're undocumented, and so they risk being deported to a country they don't actually even remember. So DACA was an attempt to provide some permanent residency to some of the Dreamers, but it does not apply to all Dreamers. And so a good benefit of this affirmative case as well is that this piece of legislation, I've read the number, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, but this piece of legislation has been introduced in every congressional session for a significant number of years. So if you wanted some, like, concrete, hard information about, like, what your policy, if you read a Dreamers app, what your policy would look like, there's a whole bunch, because the Dreamers Act has been introduced in Congress a number of times. So that would be kind of nice as well if you could answer all of the questions about what that policy would look like, what your one sentence plan and your 1AC, what it would look like in real life, because it's been attempted a whole lot of times. I don't think that you are on any sort of shaky ground in terms of things changing. I don't predict a political atmosphere in which Dreamers passes in this next competitive season. So I don't think you're looking at a situation, now watch it'll happen and you'll all message me and tell me it'll happen. But I don't think in the next competitive season, Congress is going to pass Dreamers. So I don't think your app is going to suddenly be non-inherent. You have kind of the best of both worlds on this affirmative. Like, you can read the moral ground arguments and say things like, you just shouldn't deport people to a country that they know nothing about and also may or may not even speak the language. That's a good argument to make. But you can also make some of those big stick arguments from the H-1B visas and say, we have Dreamers that are some of the best and the brightest that do all of these great, wonderful things, and then they risk being deported. And why aren't we using these people that live in the United States and have lived in the United States their whole lives? Why aren't we using their skills and their wisdom in our country? And so I think that's probably an argument you can make as well. So topicality for this, we talked about kind of at the beginning. You've got to answer this topicality argument to the United States, because they are not immigrating to the United States. They already currently live in the United States. So not a barrier you can't jump over, but just something you need to know if this is the topic that you want to read. And there is an argument to be made that if Dreamers if that piece of legislation passed, which as an affirmative you would get to fiat that Dreamers passed, there's a pretty decent argument then that President Trump's response to that would be to go all in on hardline immigration policy and build a border wall. So that's an argument as well to think about, is that, and we'll talk about that some on politics, but to keep in mind that you get fiat, so your policy passes. So then what is Congress and what will President Trump's response be when your act passes? And I think you get a particularly hard link on Dreamers because Dreamers Act has been in Congress so many times and has not passed. I think you get a pretty good link here that if Dreamers ever were to pass, there would be some sort of reaction to that. Again, not an argument that you can't overcome, just something that you need to know about that you will have to address if this is the affirmative case that you would like to read. Okay, so this is, I don't know, in the middle. This is neither. These are some arguments that Andrew and I think are criticisms of our own topic and criticisms of our own topic wording, and so they theoretically can be read on kind of both sides of the debate, and we're okay with people critiquing our resolution and our wording. So this is one. This is the argument. It's borders. It can be read on the affirmative or the negative, and it's just kind of this argument that says, like, maybe borders are just bad, and maybe we should not have those. There is an actual set of international law literature that discusses why borders exist in the first place. And borders exist in the first place because all countries in the world operate within a system of realism, which means that every country in the world operates within a system of, like, this is my land, this is my space, and if I don't protect it, someone will come and take it from me, and so I have to do whatever I can to protect my space. And that's the reason that borders exist in the first place. And so this would be an argument that says, maybe we just shouldn't have borders, like anywhere. Obviously, it's a critique. You're not going to probably, like, fiat that borders don't exist in the world anymore. You can maybe talk to some of your policy staff about, like, why that kind of fiat is probably really bad. But so it is a critical argument. If you look at the topic paper that Andrew and I wrote, there are some really good sources that we provided for this particular argument. and that's the author and the year. So if you look at our topic paper, all of the specific sources are all at the very end. So if you just find Spener in 2009 at the end, you can find the specific book and edition and all that stuff to be able to access it if you're interested in making this argument. So essentially, I hope I made that clear, but essentially you're just saying, like, we shouldn't be talking about immigration, legal or otherwise, because we just shouldn't have borders. And if we don't have borders, we don't have immigration, and that's the most important sort of discussion of the topic. So similarly, you could discuss a set of literature referred to as identity politics. In some way, my students at Athens sort of traveled through this topic writing journey with me. So, like, for an entire year, my debate team, every time we went to a tournament anywhere near a half-price books, my debate team humored me to go into half-price books and find everything I could on immigration, and then they listened to me on the long car rides, like, talk about all the interesting things I was reading. And this is one of the ones that I think they had to listen to for a long car ride, because it was really fascinating to me. So it's this sort of set of literature that says, like, the way that we talk about immigrants and immigration, period, is wrong. And that we shouldn't talk about people and human beings in that way. And so this would also be something that is on the affirmative and the negative, that just criticizes the resolution itself and says that, like, you shouldn't even be talking about immigrants or immigration, because, like, that's not how you talk about people. So Spener in 2009, I get the same research from that same book if you want to go find the specific source. But essentially, what Spener says is that, like, and I don't remember the backstory of how Spener gets their hands on the ICE handbook, but either way, the author gets their hands on the handbook for ICE, the agency that is supposed to enforce immigration law. And literally in the handbook, it says, there are two types of immigrants that we are responsible for enforcing. There are Mexican and other than Mexican. And Spener says, that's probably not okay, right? Like, that is probably not okay to just say, like, there are just these two categories, and that's it. They even have an acronym. Like, they literally, like, there's just a term in ICE literature that is OMS, other than Mexicans. That's probably not okay. And so this would be an argument that says that's bad. Spener also says that it is that kind of language that creates a virtual border around immigrants, and particularly non-immigrant, undocumented immigrants. Because he says the way that we speak about them and means that we otherize them as a person, and that those people walk around in sort of this constant state of either fear of deportation or some sort of fear of ridicule or being excluded from certain spaces, and that creates a virtual border around them. And so there's this really great line where he says it denies agents of the state the access to full rights of personhood. And so that's a really good argument if you are interested in these sorts of, I don't know, maybe it's not really off the wall, but if you're interested in doing things that are maybe a little bit different, borders and identity politics are two sort of really interesting things on this topic, because I think it's okay, and I think is even a discussion that we even intended really to happen, right, is to say, we sort of put this resolution out there and said, you know, we do want people to talk about ways that we can change immigration policy in the United States, but maybe there are also some people that want to talk about how, like, we just shouldn't talk about immigration in the way that we do, period. And that's an okay part of the discussion as well. Okay, I've been talking for about an hour, and we're going to switch to kind of we're going to start talking about the negative part of the debate. So why don't we, it's 9:56, so why don't we say like 10:02. That's really specific. 10:02, get up, stretch, go to the bathroom if you need to. Be back here in 5. All right. Hopefully that break was helpful. I know this is a lot, and I know topic lectures are usually the roughest part of camp, but hopefully you were getting some good things and you got to get up and stretch a little bit. So before we talk about the negative position, I want to take a minute to talk about the negative position in the big picture. And this slide in particular, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about, is courtesy of Dr. Rich Edwards from Baylor University. I thought that I watched a topic lecture that he did, and I thought he really succinctly discussed what the negative should look like on this topic. And so I want to talk to you about the way that you address this topic, because I have been approached by kind of a number of people that say, how do you debate the negative side of this topic without doing or saying something that is offensive to people? And so I spent a lot of time talking kind of casually and informally to coaches about what I think that looks like, but I think Dr. Edwards sort of summed it up in a really great way. So it is absolutely possible for you on the negative to defend many of President Trump's conservative policies on immigration in ways that are potentially offensive. So you can absolutely take that line of thinking on the negative side and create some kind of fear-mongering, right? And you can say things like maybe President Trump has, that say, like, you know, immigrants are bad and scary and commit crimes. That is a possibility for you on the negative. I would like to suggest to you that that is neither good in terms of like things probably that people should be saying, but maybe most importantly is not even the most strategic for you to say in a debate round. So the reason I say that is because, as Dr. Edwards pointed out, any of that literature is going to come from these specific sources that you see here: the Federation of American Immigration Reform, the Center for Immigration Studies, and Numbers USA. Before you start citing these sources that will say things like immigrants that come to the United States are scary and do scary things, I highly encourage you to read these articles, and we will post a copy of this PowerPoint onto the website, so don't worry about having to write down, you know, the exact URL or whatever. This will be posted on the website, and then you'll be able to just click and look at those articles. The person who writes the articles for all of those, you will find some very interesting facts about him in these articles that I've provided. So before you start citing these particular sources that do probably support some of the things that are happening and being said in maybe national news media, I encourage you to go read some things about who that author is on those topics and where he comes from. Because I think that you will find it is not even a strategic choice for you to make those sorts of arguments, because I can guarantee you that policy debaters that I coach, will definitely respond to those arguments with, hey, by the way, your Center for Immigration Studies piece of evidence that you read, that is written by this person. Here are some other things that he has said that are also really offensive, and here are some other really offensive organizations that he affiliates with. So I promise that debaters that I work with will be making that argument, and so just be prepared. For the coaches in the room, I think Dr. Edwards had great advice in his session when he said that if your students are really insistent on making these types of arguments, you might let them. And I say that you might let them because I think they'll lose. And I think that then they will learn not to make those arguments. So I think that's potentially something that you have to discuss as a team about what sorts of things you should be saying on the negative. I do want you to know as well that we spent a lot of time making sure that there were arguments to be made on the affirmative and the negative that did not consist of people being offensive in any way. So I want to talk to you about some of those negative arguments that are not offensive in any way. So our topic paper discusses this disadvantage, which is the brain drain disadvantage. This is the argument that if we take skilled workers from everywhere else, then we in the United States have all of the skilled workers and other people don't. And that's bad because it leads to static economies. And we do live in a global economic world where in some ways our economy is dependent upon other people's economy. So it is even bad for us to just like take everybody's skilled workers and then their economies significantly decline. That's even bad for our economy because we live in a global economic world. And additionally, it obviously leads to economic issues in the country of origin, and so that's maybe something that's bad. This is obviously additionally particularly links to any like employment based affirmatives. So any of these affirmatives that are going to talk about H-1B visas, things like that, that's going to specifically link to the brain drain DISAD, but maybe doesn't link as much for some of the other affirmatives, like maybe U visas or T visas. Maybe doesn't link as much to a brain drain DISAD. So this is an interesting disadvantage, I think, as well. Research indicates that the United States is at its carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is a term of art in population studies, and it is essentially what it sounds like. It is the number of people that a particular country can support in terms of its resources. And so literature indicates that we are there. We are at our carrying capacity. More immigration to the United States would put the United States over its carrying capacity. And so that would be bad for things like the environment because we would have a lack of resources. That means we're going to cut down more trees, things like that, to provide resources to the new people that are coming into the United States. Some people would argue that that there should be some sort of safety valve in the global community. And what that means is that countries like the United States that are at carrying capacity, or even some other countries in Europe that would be considered like underpopulated technically, so like their death rate is actually higher than their birth rate. There are people that say that there should maybe be a safety valve where people from overpopulated countries move into some of the less populated areas and then it like evens out the global community. For this particular disadvantage, there's some good literature that says that safety valve should not exist because then overpopulated countries are never forced to face the realities of their environmental decisions. And so it says that like countries there shouldn't be a safety valve. We shouldn't try to like even the global community out, but overpopulated countries should figure out how to develop policies that are good for the environment and should do those things. And of course the impact to the population DISAD is going to be things like environmental destruction. All right, so I alluded to this a couple of times, but you definitely have your links to Insert Politics DISAD here because immigration is really hotly debated, and probably you will find lots of research and literature about that. So, I mean, one we've kind of already talked about, right? This is sort of the argument that if you get to fiat that your immigration policy passes, the Republicans in Congress and President Trump will respond with really harsh immigration policies. And maybe that is potentially bad. The midterms will also happen in this competitive season. Excuse me. And so you can make lots of arguments about the way in which immigration policy will affect the midterms, because I feel like you're probably on the right side of that part of the debate, at the very least, that your immigration policy that you get to fiat will definitely have a result on midterms policy, or sorry, on midterms results. Remember, the 2016 Pew Research study that said 70% of Americans said immigration was very important. It was more important than the economy and the environment. So, if immigration policy is passed, Americans will most certainly respond in the midterms to let the politicians know how they feel about that immigration policy. So, you'll definitely affect midterms elections, and so I would encourage you to know lots of things about politics DISADs and how those work going into this next competitive year. And then remember, when the midterms happen and they're over, you have to stop reading that DISAD. You cannot keep reading that it will affect midterms in January. Oh, okay. Okay, so that kind of gives you a broad, big picture of the immigration topic. Hopefully it was lots of great information, and hopefully you now have lots of